High above the clouds, a commercial airliner shuddered violently as passengers screamed in terror. The pilot had collapsed unconscious in the cockpit. Flight attendants frantically called for help over the radio, their voices filled with desperation. A brown-haired woman with calm demeanor stepped into the cockpit. Mocking laughter echoed from passengers. "She's just a flight nurse. She can't fly a plane." But minutes later, her voice over the radio made the entire sky thunder. F-22 pilots went silent in shock. "That call sign! It can't be possible!" Reina Vasquez moved through the narrow aisle of Flight 447 with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her 3 years working as a flight nurse for commercial airlines. At 28, her long brown hair pulled back in regulation style, and her calm demeanor made her nearly invisible among the more assertive personalities that dominated airline crew hierarchies. To the passengers and crew who flew with her regularly, she was exactly what she appeared to be: a competent medical professional whose job was handling in-flight health emergencies and supporting passenger comfort during long international flights. "Reina's good at her job," Captain Morrison would tell new crew members during briefings. "But she's medical support, not aviation personnel. She knows how to treat air sickness and handle medical emergencies, but that's about the extent of her qualifications." Flight attendant supervisor Patricia Williams was more direct in her assessment. "She's quiet, reliable, and stays within her scope of practice. Perfect for a support role, but she doesn't have the personality or background for anything more demanding." Reina would listen to such evaluations without comment, focusing instead on preparing medical equipment and reviewing passenger manifests for travelers who might require special attention during the flight. While her crew saw only a dedicated medical professional whose expertise was limited to healthcare applications, Reina used her position to observe everything about aviation operations that others took for granted. She understood weather patterns through their effects on passenger comfort, recognized mechanical problems through subtle changes in aircraft behavior, and monitored navigation procedures through announcements and crew communications. More importantly, she found ways to serve that went beyond official medical duties. When elderly passengers struggled with complex seatbelt mechanisms, Reina would quietly assist them without making them feel incompetent. When children became anxious during turbulence, she would sit with them and explain what was happening in terms that transformed fear into curiosity. When nervous flyers showed signs of panic attacks, she would provide breathing techniques and reassurance that helped them manage their anxiety. "Just trying to ensure passenger safety and comfort," she would say when anyone noticed these efforts, deflecting attention from care that exceeded standard medical protocols. These quiet acts of service were dismissed as typical behavior from someone whose job was passenger welfare rather than evidence of broader aviation knowledge and experience. "She's naturally nurturing," observed Chief Flight Attendant Rodriguez, who coordinated crew assignments. "Medical personnel often have good bedside manner, but that doesn't translate to understanding complex flight operations." But Reina's understanding of flight operations went far deeper than her current position would suggest. In her personal flight bag, wrapped carefully in protective material, she carried a silver identification card engraved with a call sign that connected her to operations so classified they remain known only to select military aviation personnel. The card bore the designation Silent Hawk, a call sign that had belonged to one of the most accomplished military pilots in recent operational history, someone whose missions had influenced air combat tactics at the highest levels of military aviation. Her transition to civilian medical aviation after classified military service had been her choice, motivated by a desire to continue serving people who traveled by air without the psychological burden of the combat missions that had defined her previous career. The silver card represented capabilities that had been tested under conditions that exceeded anything civilian aviation normally encountered, missions that had required skills most pilots never developed, and teammates who had died during operations that remained classified at levels requiring complete operational security. Passenger Margaret Chen later recalled, I watched her sit beside an elderly man who was having breathing difficulties, holding his hand for 2 hours straight. Nobody asked her to do that. Nobody would have known if she hadn't. But I saw something in her eyes that suggested she had seen people in much worse situations and knew how to help them through it. Flight 447 from Los Angeles to Tokyo had been routine until 30,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, when Captain Morrison suddenly collapsed in the pilot's seat. The veteran pilot, who had over 20 years of commercial aviation experience, clutched his chest and lost consciousness from what appeared to be a massive heart attack. First Officer Jenkins, barely 2 years out of flight training, found himself solely responsible for a Boeing 777 carrying 284 passengers across one of the world's most challenging flight corridors. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 447, Jenkins transmitted with obvious panic in his voice. "Captain is down. Medical emergency in cockpit, requesting immediate assistance." The aircraft began experiencing severe turbulence as Jenkins struggled to maintain course and altitude while dealing with the medical crisis. Passengers screamed as the plane lurched and shuddered, oxygen masks deploying automatically when the cabin pressure fluctuated. Reina immediately responded to the medical emergency, rushing to the cockpit with her medical equipment. But when she arrived, she found a situation that required more than medical intervention. "Let me help," she said, moving toward the pilot controls, while simultaneously checking Captain Morrison's vital signs. "No," Jenkins shouted, his voice cracking with stress and adrenaline. "You're medical personnel, not a pilot. Get back to the cabin and let me handle this." The flight attendants, who had gathered in the cockpit doorway, echoed Jenkins's dismissal with voices that mixed fear and authority. "Reina, you need to focus on medical care," insisted Patricia Williams. "Flying the aircraft is not your responsibility or qualification." Passengers who could see into the cockpit began shouting their own opinions about what should happen. "Don't let the nurse touch the controls," yelled businessman Robert Chen from his first-class seat. "She'll kill us all." But Reina had already assessed the tactical situation with capabilities that her civilian aviation experience hadn't revealed. The aircraft was flying through a weather system that required precise navigation. The autopilot was malfunctioning due to the pilot's collapse having disrupted cockpit procedures. And First Officer Jenkins was approaching panic levels that would make effective flying impossible. "Jenkins, you're overcorrecting for wind shear," she said calmly, monitoring the instrument panel while continuing to provide medical care to Captain Morrison. "Reduce throttle by 15% and adjust heading 2 degrees west." Jenkins stared at her with confusion and desperation. "How do you know about wind shear compensation?" "Because I've flown in worse conditions than this," Reina replied, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the cockpit pause their objections. She quickly performed the medical procedures necessary to stabilize Captain Morrison, then moved to the co-pilot position with movements that seemed natural rather than hesitant. "I need you to trust me," she told Jenkins. "I can get us through this weather system, but you need to follow my guidance exactly." "You're a flight nurse," Jenkins replied, but his voice now carried hope rather than dismissal. "Where did you learn to read aviation instruments?" Reina was already making the minute adjustments to heading and altitude that would navigate them through the turbulent weather system. Her hands moved across the controls with unconscious precision that suggested extensive experience with aircraft operations under challenging conditions. "Previous training," she said, not elaborating on the nature or extent of that training. Chief Flight Attendant Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation from the cabin, noticed that the aircraft's erratic movement had stabilized significantly since Reina had begun providing guidance. "The turbulence is decreasing," he reported over the intercom. "Whatever's happening in the cockpit seems to be working." But passengers remained skeptical about having their lives dependent on someone whose qualifications they didn't understand. "This is insane," shouted Margaret Thompson from her middle aisle seat. "We're trusting our lives to someone who probably learned to fly from video games." However, the aircraft continued to fly with increasing stability as Reina guided Jenkins through navigation procedures that exceeded what most commercial pilots learned during standard training. "Request permission to contact military air traffic control," Reina told Jenkins. "I need to establish communication with specialized navigation support." "Why military ATC?" Jenkins asked, following her instructions while trying to understand how a flight nurse knew about military aviation protocols. "Because they have the precision navigation capabilities we need to get through this weather system safely." Reina reached for the radio with movements that suggested she had used military communication systems before, her hands automatically finding the correct frequencies and authentication procedures. When she spoke into the microphone, her voice carried the professional competence that military personnel use when communicating critical information under high-stress conditions. "Silent Hawk requesting emergency navigation assistance. Authentication code follows." The words seemed to electrify the radio frequency as air traffic controllers processed a call sign that appeared in databases they hadn't expected to encounter during civilian flight operations. First Officer Jenkins later described that moment. "When she took the co-pilot controls, everything changed. The aircraft responded to her inputs like she had been flying for decades. That wasn't beginner's luck. That was someone who understood aviation at a level that most of us never achieve." The response to Reina's radio transmission was immediate and electric. Military air traffic controllers who had been monitoring civilian flight corridors suddenly found themselves processing a call sign that existed in classified databases and carried security clearances that exceeded normal commercial aviation protocols. "Silent Hawk, this is Edwards Control," came the reply from an Air Force base that had been tracking Flight 447's distress situation. "Confirm authentication and state emergency status." Reina provided technical authentication codes that verified her identity while simultaneously continuing to guide First Officer Jenkins through navigation procedures that were stabilizing the aircraft's flight path through dangerous weather conditions. But the real impact of her call sign was being felt at military installations across the Pacific Theater, where pilots and air traffic controllers recognized a designation that belonged to someone whose aviation achievements had become legendary in classified military circles. At Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, 2 F-22 Raptor pilots who had been conducting routine training exercises received emergency orders to establish contact with Flight 447. "Ghost Leader, you are directed to intercept and escort civilian flight with call sign Silent Hawk on board," came the command from their squadron commander. Captain Sarah Williams, the lead F-22 pilot, nearly lost control of her aircraft when she heard the call sign. "Sir, confirm that last. Did you say Silent Hawk?" "Affirmative, Ghost Leader. Silent Hawk is aboard Flight 447 and has requested emergency escort assistance." Captain Williams and her wingmen exchanged glances through their cockpit canopies that conveyed the magnitude of what they were hearing. Silent Hawk was a name that appeared in their most classified briefings, associated with air combat achievements that had shaped tactical doctrine and saved lives in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Ghost 2, do you understand what this means?" Williams transmitted to her wingman. "Copy, Ghost Leader. Silent Hawk was... we thought Silent Hawk was listed as killed in action 3 years ago during Operation Desert Mirage," Williams completed. "But if Silent Hawk is alive and flying civilian aircraft..." The F-22s accelerated to intercept Flight 447, their pilots struggling to process the implications of encountering someone whose military aviation achievements exceeded anything in their own experience. Meanwhile, aboard Flight 447, passengers were beginning to understand that their flight nurse possessed qualifications that went far beyond medical training. The aircraft was now flying with precision that exceeded what First Officer Jenkins could have achieved alone, navigating through weather conditions that should have required emergency landing procedures. "How is she doing this?" asked businessman Robert Chen, who had been watching Reina's work from the first-class cabin. "She's flying like a military pilot." Chief Flight Attendant Rodriguez had been monitoring communications between the cockpit and ground control, hearing references to military protocols and navigation techniques that weren't part of civilian aviation training. "I think we need to reconsider what we know about Reina's background," he told the other flight attendants. When the F-22s appeared alongside Flight 447, their presence was immediately visible to passengers looking out the windows. The sight of military fighter aircraft escorting a commercial flight created an atmosphere of awe and confusion among travelers who were trying to understand what was happening. "Ghost leader to Silent Hawk," came Captain Williams' voice over the radio, her transmission audible throughout the aircraft's cabin. "We are honored to provide escort. The entire Pacific Air Command sends respect." Reina's response was delivered with the calm professionalism that military personnel recognized as the mark of someone who had operated under extreme pressure. "Ghost leader, appreciate the escort. Request clearance for priority landing at nearest suitable facility." "Silent Hawk, you have priority clearance for any facility you choose. Whatever you need, we'll make it happen." The exchange between Reina and the F-22 pilots was being monitored by passengers who were beginning to realize that their flight nurse was someone whose military service had earned the respect of America's most elite fighter pilots. Elderly passenger James Rodriguez, a Vietnam War veteran, recognized the tone and protocols being used in the radio communications. "Ma'am," he called to Reina from his seat, "I know that voice. You coordinated air support for ground units, didn't you? In Iraq? Afghanistan?" Reina's reply was brief but confirmed what many passengers were beginning to suspect. "I did what was necessary to bring people home safely." "You were the pilot who provided close air support during the evacuation of Ramadi," Rodriguez continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandson was part of that operation. You saved his unit." The revelation spread through the cabin as passengers processed the information that their flight nurse was actually a decorated military pilot whose service had saved lives in combat operations. First Officer Jenkins, who had been following Reina's guidance throughout the emergency, finally understood why her aviation knowledge exceeded anything he had learned in commercial flight training. "You're not just a flight nurse," he said as they approached their emergency landing destination. "You're a combat pilot." "I was a combat pilot," Reina corrected. "Now I'm a flight nurse who sometimes needs to use old skills to keep passengers safe." As Flight 447 touched down at San Francisco International Airport, with precision that impressed even the F-22 pilots who had escorted them, passengers began to understand that they had been saved by someone whose capabilities far exceeded her current job description. Emergency medical teams rushed Captain Morrison to intensive care, where doctors later confirmed that Reina's immediate medical intervention had prevented a fatal heart attack from becoming a tragedy. But perhaps more significantly, 284 passengers and crew members had been safely delivered through dangerous weather conditions by someone whose aviation skills had been developed during military operations that officially never existed. When Reina deplaned and was met by airline officials, military personnel, and media representatives, she declined most requests for interviews or public recognition. "I just did my job," she told the assembled crowd. "Medical care and passenger safety, that's what flight nurses are trained for." But Captain Williams and her wingman, who had landed their F-22s to meet Silent Hawk in person, approached Reina with the respect that military personnel show towards someone whose service has exceeded their own. "Ma'am," Captain Williams said, rendering a perfect salute, "it was an honor to escort you home. Type I owe a debt if you've ever been saved by someone whose true qualifications you never knew. Heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just quietly ensure everyone gets home safely." The media attention following Flight 447's emergency landing was immediate and intense, with aviation journalists and news organizations requesting interviews about what they termed the miracle flight and the nurse who could fly. Reina declined all such requests, choosing instead to return to her regular duties as a flight nurse on scheduled commercial routes. "I prefer to focus on medical care rather than aviation stories," she told airline officials who suggested she might be interested in transitioning back to pilot duties. My current position allows me to help passengers in ways that align with my personal goals. The passengers whose lives she had saved began approaching her with gratitude that went beyond simple thanks for professional service. They understood that they had been in the presence of someone whose capabilities exceeded anything they had initially recognized. First Officer Jenkins, whose panic during the emergency had been transformed into effective flying through Reina's guidance, sought her out during crew briefings to express his appreciation and ask for additional training. "Ma'am, would you be willing to provide some guidance on advanced navigation techniques? What you did during that storm was beyond anything I learned in flight school." "I'll teach you whatever helps make you a more effective pilot," Reina replied. "But some techniques require experience that comes from situations I hope you never encounter." The F-22 pilots who had escorted Flight 447 requested permission to visit Reina during her layovers, seeking to pay respects to someone whose military aviation achievements had influenced their own training. "Silent Hawk, your air support coordination during Operation Desert Mirage became standard doctrine for close air support missions," Captain Williams told her during one of their meetings. "You probably saved more lives than most people realize." "I saved the lives I could save," Reina replied, "just like every other pilot who served in those operations." Chief Flight Attendant Rodriguez, who had witnessed Reina's transformation from flight nurse to combat pilot during the emergency, began treating her with a respect that acknowledged capabilities he had never suspected. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why choose flight nursing over returning to military aviation?" Reina was quiet for a moment, touching the silver Silent Hawk identification card she carried as a reminder of missions that had tested every aspect of her training and cost the lives of teammates she would never forget. "Rodriguez, military aviation requires making decisions about who lives and who dies. Civilian medical aviation lets me focus on keeping people alive without those complications." "But you could probably have any aviation assignment you wanted." "I have the assignment I want, taking care of passengers who trust me to keep them safe during the most routine parts of their lives." The airline industry's response to Reina's demonstrated capabilities included offers for pilot positions, training roles, and administrative assignments that would have advanced her career significantly. She declined them all. "My goal is serving passengers who need medical care, not advancing through aviation hierarchies," she told management representatives who couldn't understand why someone with her qualifications would choose support roles over leadership positions. Late at night, when flights were delayed and airports were quiet, Reina would sit in empty gate areas and think about the path that had led her from classified military operations to civilian medical aviation. The choice had been difficult, motivated by losses that couldn't be discussed and psychological burdens that couldn't be shared with people who hadn't experienced similar responsibilities. But it had also been the right choice for someone who wanted to continue serving people who traveled by air without the moral complexity of missions that required choosing between competing values. "Still flying," she would whisper to memories of teammates who had died during operations that officially never happened. "Just helping people instead of fighting wars." Type "I will live boldly" if you believe that true service doesn't require recognition or prestigious positions. Heroes often choose to work behind the scenes, ensuring others reach their destinations safely. This story isn't just about one flight nurse's dramatic intervention during a mid-air emergency. This is about the fundamental error we make when we judge people based on their current job titles rather than their complete backgrounds and capabilities. It's about the dangerous assumption that support roles are filled by people who lack the qualifications for more demanding positions, rather than by people who have chosen to serve in ways that align with their values and personal priorities. Reina Vasquez represents something our society needs to understand. The most qualified people are often those who deliberately choose positions that don't showcase their full range of abilities. They work in support, service, and care roles not because they're limited, but because they understand that meaningful contribution comes in many forms. An impact doesn't always require recognition. Consider what you witnessed. A woman dismissed as just a flight nurse, saved 284 lives using aviation skills that exceeded what most commercial pilots develop in their entire careers. Her 3 years of medical aviation work weren't evidence of career limitations. They were her chosen method of continuing to serve people who travel by air without the psychological burden of combat mission responsibility. But here's the deeper truth her story reveals. Every workplace, every service industry, every organization contains people whose backgrounds and capabilities remain hidden until circumstances reveal them. The flight attendant might have managed international operations. The customer service representative might have crisis management experience that exceeds what most executives ever develop. The support staff member might have technical expertise that shaped entire industries. These people aren't underperforming in lesser roles. They're choosing to serve in ways that allow them to help others without the complications that come with authority, recognition, or high visibility responsibility. The most dangerous mistake we make is assuming that someone's current position reflects their maximum capabilities. But Reina's story proves that sometimes the most accomplished people deliberately choose ordinary roles, not because they're incapable of extraordinary responsibility, but because they've already carried extraordinary responsibility and now prioritize different forms of service. This has profound implications for how we treat people in service positions, how we assess human potential, and how we recognize value in our communities. The person ensuring your comfort during travel might be the same person who could save your life if circumstances required capabilities beyond normal service training. Tomorrow you might fly somewhere and interact with crew members who appear to be performing routine service functions. Before you make assumptions about their backgrounds or capabilities, remember Reina's story. That quiet person ensuring your safety and comfort might be carrying qualifications and experience that exceed anything you've imagined. Because heroes don't always announce themselves, and the most important service often happens in ways that remain invisible until emergencies reveal the extraordinary people who have been working quietly among us, ensuring our safety while asking for nothing more than the opportunity to continue serving others. If you believe in stories that honor hidden service and extraordinary people in ordinary roles, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to LN Steelheart Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people creating real stories, not mass-produced AI.